When white opens the game with e4 and is greeted with the Sicilian defense, c5, if white doesn't want to enter the incredible complications of the open Sicilian with knight f3, followed by d4, then white can consider choosing an anti-Sicilian. One interesting choice is to play the closed Sicilian, which, just as it sounds, avoids opening lines quickly and doesn't require white to memorize several critical lines in order to play it effectively. We reach the closed Sicilian after the moves e4, gaining space in the center and preparing d4. The most dynamic way to counter this plan is to play c5, fighting for control of the d4 square, turning the game into the dynamic Sicilian defense. Instead of playing knight f3, followed by a quick d4, turning the game into the open Sicilian, white can decide to steer the game toward the closed Sicilian with knight c3, centralizing the knight and remaining flexible with kingside development. In this video, we're going to focus on the closed Sicilian based upon the move g3, preparing a kingside fianchetto. If you plan on playing these positions as black, it's important not to assume that your opponent is going to play g3 on the next turn. Depending on how black responds, white can decide to play knight f3 and then prepare to turn the game into the open Sicilian with d4. For example, if you assume white is going to play g3, the characteristic closed Sicilian idea, and you decide to prepare a kingside fianchetto with g6, instead of playing g3, white may decide to shift gears and play knight f3, when after bishop g7 and d4, after c takes d4, you suddenly find yourself in the hyper-accelerated dragon variation of the Sicilian defense. This is a perfectly reasonable opening if you play it intentionally as black, but you definitely don't want to find yourself move-ordered into an opening you are not comfortable playing. This is why it's important as a Sicilian player to be prepared if your opponent tries to turn the game into the open Sicilian instead of continuing with the closed Sicilian strategy. Depending on what black typically plays against the open Sicilian, there's a wide variety of options, including d6, e6, and even a6, preparing b5 as reasonable choices to consider. We're going to mostly focus on the flexible response, knight c6, centralizing the knight and adding more protection to the d4 square. If white decides to play knight f3, inviting a potential open Sicilian transposition with d4, black can decide to play e5, denying white the option of opening the game immediately with d4. One other line to be aware of is f4 on the third move, known as the Grand Prix attack, which can be dangerous, but with proper preparation, black should be just fine. Okay, that's enough discussion regarding transpositional possibilities. Now let's explore the closed Sicilian, which is reached after white plays g3. Compared to the open Sicilian, the closed Sicilian is typically slower paced when most of the pieces tend to stay on the board. This doesn't mean it is only a slow-paced positional opening, as dangerous kingside attacks can appear seemingly out of nowhere if black isn't careful. A solid, active response to the closed Sicilian is also fianchettoing on the kingside with g6, when after bishop g2 and bishop g7, the dark-squared bishop joins the long diagonal, helping control the key d4 square, and also prepares to help support queenside play, a common area of focus for black. White can remain flexible with d3, supporting the center and opening up an important diagonal for the dark-squared bishop. A typical response for black is d6, which we'll examine in a moment, but sometimes black decides to play e6. One idea is to use the e7 square to develop the knight, and then possibly play d6, or prepare to later strike in the center with d5. White's dark-squared bishop typically finds a home on e3, adding pressure against the c5 pawn. This move also prepares a potential queen-bishop battery with queen d2, when with proper preparation, white can try to exchange dark-squared bishops with bishop h6. One sensible plan for black is to play d6, supporting the center, when black can continue to develop with knight g to e7, with the potential option of expanding on the queen side with rook b8 and b5, a typical plan we'll definitely revisit in other variations. Instead, if black decides to defend the c5 pawn and centralize the knight with knight d4, white has the interesting idea of playing knight c to e2, offering a trade of knights and preparing c3. Black can now respond with d6 or knight e7, both reasonable options, but black has to be careful after knight takes e2, knight takes e2. It appears white is simply losing material after bishop takes b2, rook b1, It's important for black to play bishop g7, but if black tries to win material with queen a5 check, forking the king and pawn on a2, this turns out to be a serious mistake, as white can play bishop d2, with the point that after queen takes a2, white has the tactical shot rook takes b2, attracting the enemy queen to the long diagonal with queen takes b2, when white can deliver an unpleasant fork with bishop c3, attacking the queen and rook on h8 when white is winning material. Instead of the blunder queen a5 check, if black insists on entering this line and capturing the b2 pawn, a risky decision, then the bishop should retreat to g7. In a game from the 2007 United States Championship, Grandmaster Alexander Strapunski played bishop takes c5. White regains material and adds pressure against the weakened dark squares in black's position. His opponent, future Grandmaster Brian Smith, played d6, when white maintained the tension on the a3 to f8 diagonal with bishop a3. White enjoys an active rook on the b file, a lead in development, and has serious pressure against black's d6 pawn. White went on to win a nice game. Notice that queen a5 check, forking the king and bishop on a3, doesn't actually win material, as white can play bishop b4, attacking the queen when the bishop is supported by the rook on b1. Instead of playing e6, a solid alternative is d6, adding more control to the central dark squares and opening a diagonal for the light-squared bishop. By analyzing the central pawn chains, we can see the basic ideas for both sides. White's central pawn chain from c2 to e4 points toward the king side, so white will often play f4, preparing to attack on the king side and grab more space with f5 if allowed. Black, on the other hand, has a pawn chain starting from e7 and moving to c5, pointing toward the queen side, so a common plan for black is to prepare b5 and possibly b4, extending the pawn chain and grabbing more space on the queen side. White has several choices at this point, including centralizing the bishop with bishop e3, developing the knight with knight g to e2, or as former world champion Boris Spassky liked to play, the aggressive f4. White immediately grabs more space in the center and king side, declaring intentions to attack on that side of the board. If black is worried about the f5 break, a solid choice is e6, preparing knight g to e7. But a popular option for black is to play e5, taking a fair share of space in the center, adding pressure against f4, and continuing to dominate the d4 square. In exchange for these positive features, the d5 square has been weakened, so just as black may consider a future knight d4, white may take advantage of the exposed d5 square with a future knight d5. White now has an important decision to make, where to develop the knight on g1. Moving the knight to e2 or f3 are both reasonable options, but if white is in a fighting mood, then the most dynamic choice is to play knight h3. At first glance, it may seem strange to move the knight to the edge of the board, but there are several positive points supporting this idea. To start, if black resolves the tension with e takes f4, opening up the dark squared bishop on the long diagonal, white can centralize the knight with knight takes f4, when the knight may find an excellent post on d5. The main attacking points behind this move include eyeing the g5 square, and most importantly, keeping the f-file open for white's rook, as well as the d1 to h5 diagonal for white's queen. One sensible option for black is to play knight g to e7, centralizing the knight, supporting the d5 square, and also adding more protection against a possible f4 to f5 pawn advance. White's most popular option is to castle the king. It may appear black has everything under control, but if black castles the king, white can play the dangerous attacking resource f5, threatening a fork on f6, and offering a pawn sacrifice to create a dangerous kingside attack. Sometimes black decides to respond with f6, but the most common response is g takes f5, when white takes advantage of the open h5 square with queen h5, adding pressure against both the h7 and f5 pawns. Black needs to play carefully, because if black tries to grab another pawn with f takes e4, this greedy move opens the f-file, allowing white's pieces to overwhelm black's defenses with knight g5. The knight joins the queen and rook in the kingside attack, threatening queen takes h7, checkmate. When after h6, white can play the crushing knight takes f7, intending knight takes h6 check when black's kingside is falling apart. After white plays the dangerous queen h5, black should seriously consider playing f6, allowing white to regain the pawn with e takes f5 when black can challenge white's queen with queen e8, offering a trade of queens and trying to slow down white's attack. Instead, if black decides to add more protection to the f5 square with knight d4, also attacking the c2 pawn, white can ignore this threat and continue to attack on the kingside with e takes f5, opening up the long diagonal for white's light-squared bishop, as well as threatening a fork on f6. If black decides to capture the f5 pawn with one of the knights, then white has the dangerous ideas of playing bishop e4, as well as g4, opening the diagonal leading to the h7 pawn, a key target for white's kingside attack. If black plays f6, blocking the f5 pawn, but opening up a diagonal toward black's king, white has the strong response knight d5, continuing to invade black's position and also preparing to attack black's knight with c3. Finally, if black plays bishop takes f5, instead of playing bishop takes b7, which would allow the strong response bishop g6, refuting white's attack, white can play the powerful exchange sacrifice rook takes f5, eliminating black's key defender of the light squares when after knight e takes f5, white builds a dangerous attack with bishop e4, attacking the pinned knight, exposing black's weakened light squares on the king side by x-raying the weak h7 pawn, so white enjoys a strong initiative. Instead of castling and allowing the dangerous f4 to f5 pawn break, black can consider playing e takes f4, opening up the long diagonal for black's dark-squared bishop. If white plays g takes f4, black can blockade the f4 pawn with f5. This move does somewhat weaken the light squares, but by preventing the advance of the f4 pawn, white's attacking chances are greatly reduced, so black has nothing to fear in this position. Instead of capturing on f4 with the g3 pawn, allowing black to close the f-file, white can consider playing bishop takes f4, activating the dark-squared bishop and adding pressure against black's backward pawn on d6. And another option is to play knight takes f4. White centralizes the knight, adding more control over d5. White typically will continue with g4, threatening to exploit black's dark squares with g5. So black will often respond to g4 with h6. Black can then focus on the typical idea of queenside expansion with rook b8 and b5, with an interesting struggle ahead. Instead of playing e5, preparing to develop the g8 knight to e7, black can also play the straightforward knight f6. This natural-looking move invites white to prepare a kingside pawn storm with h3, g4, f5, and possibly harass the knight with g5. Let's follow a game between two grandmasters to see some of the typical ideas for both sides. Grandmaster Basim Amin, playing white, decided to develop the knight with knight f3, keeping the h3 square open to prepare a future pawn storm with h3 and g4. His opponent, Grandmaster Emre Can, castled his king, when white also responded with castling. Both sides will continue to expand where they enjoy more space. White will attack on the king side, and black will counterattack on the queen side. In order to prepare queenside expansion, black played the instructive move, rook b8, preparing b5 without wasting a move on a6, as black would rather advance this pawn to a5 in a single move. The rook also escapes the long light-squared diagonal, as white's bishop on g2 could cause problems once black opens its diagonal with b5. White prepared his kingside expansion with h3. When both sides continued with their respective plans, black grabbed space on the queen side with b5, and white takes space on the king side with g4. Black now gained a tempo against white's knight and grabbed more space with b4. White was happy to maneuver another piece toward the king side with knight e2. Play continued with a5 and f5. It definitely can feel a bit scary to see all of white's pawns marching toward your king, which is why the closed Sicilian can be a very dangerous opening if black is not well prepared. This is especially true at amateur level, but with proper play, black's position is just fine. One sensible move is bishop a6, preparing c4. But black decided to attack white's pawn chain immediately with c4, inviting white to destroy his own pawn chain with d takes c4, when black can play bishop a6, attacking the weak c4 pawn, or even immediately capturing the e4 pawn with the knight. Although white enjoys a space advantage on the king side, it's important to keep in mind that this is open lines against the king. So if white marches forward with g5, then we see another point behind playing c5 to c4. Queen b6 is now an annoying check white would prefer not to face. This is why white decided to continue to develop and protect the weak and dark squares with bishop e3. Black now intensified the pressure against d3 with bishop a6, when white responded with queen d2, creating a queen-bishop battery pointing directly at black's king side. As white continues to increase the tension on the king side, black will focus on queenside play, as well as increasing pressure against white's center. Both sides will enjoy reasonable chances, and after many adventures, this Grandmaster game was eventually drawn. When white plays the closed Sicilian, it is common for white to play g3 immediately against most of black's responses. One important distinction to keep in mind is e6, possibly preparing a quick d5. So if white plays g3 immediately, black can gain good counterplay with d5. A more flexible approach is to first play knight g to e2. The point is, if black immediately plays d5, then white can play e takes d5, e takes d5, and d4, fixing black's d5 pawn, which will be a target for white's pieces. Instead of playing d5 immediately, black can decide to develop and add more protection to the d4 square with knight c6. White can invite a transposition to the open Sicilian with d4, or else keep the game in closed Sicilian territory with g3, preparing the typical bishop g2 fianchetto. Grandmaster Boris Spassky, when playing with the black pieces, decided to strike in the center with d5. After the central exchanges e takes d5, e takes d5, since black first developed the knight on c6 before playing d5, black is now ready to respond to d4 with bishop g4, pinning the e2 knight, preparing to play knight takes d4, and after bishop g4, black's bishop is ready to move to f3, attacking white's rook. Instead of playing d4, Spassky's opponent, former world champion Bobby Fischer, immediately added pressure against the d5 pawn with bishop g2. Spassky advanced the threatened pawn with d4, attacking the knight, but increasing the strength of white's light-squared bishop on the long diagonal. White continued with knight d5. White's knight assumes a strong post on d5 with the idea of reinforcing this piece with knight e to f4. Although white has a comfortable-looking position, black does have a space advantage and reasonable counter chances by playing natural developing moves. In the game, Bobby Fischer was able to bring home the victory as white in this interesting struggle. The closed Sicilian is a solid anti-Sicilian option. Most of the pieces tend to stay on the board, so it allows great scope for positional maneuvering. This opening can catch an unsuspecting opponent off guard, especially if white plays an early f4 pawn advance. If black is well prepared, then white shouldn't necessarily expect an objective opening advantage. If you prefer to avoid a theoretical opening debate and just want to reach an interesting, playable middle game, then the closed Sicilian may be a welcome addition to your repertoire.